Hello everyone, my name is Richard. I'm a candidate master from Sweden, and in this video we will have a look at Bobby Fischer in the 1962 Interzonal tournament in Stockholm. And we'll see if we can learn something from this game, so I will try to guide you. And in the first round, Fischer was black and he was playing against Rudolf Teschner, a 7-time Berlin or city champion of Berlin and also international master. So in this interzone tournament there was no easy opponents and there was quite a high level of all the participants. In the first move, Rudolf played 1 d4 and black played knight f6, which is one of Fischer's favorites. White played c4 and black played g6, preparing to develop the bishop to g7 or fianchetto the bishop. White played knight c3 and bishop g7. White plays e4. He grabs a big pawn center with pawns on c4, d4, e4. Black decides to castle. This move is a little bit unusual, but probably it's something that Fischer prepared. It's a little bit provocative because you're allowing white to play e5 and gain a big tempo and just pushing the center. But if you actually play e5, I believe that you could play knight e8 and then f4, d6, bishop e3, and you need to play very actively here. Otherwise, if you play slow, white will manage to consolidate this big pawn center and you will have some big problems. So c5 is interesting, and if d takes c5, you should probably play knight c6 to put a lot of pressure on the e5 pawn. So if white takes on d6 with the c pawn, you take back with the e pawn, and then probably you can play queen a5 and then you can prepare to take on e5 quite soon. So probably white's pawn center will crack under this pressure. So in the game, knight f3 was played, which is a more solid move than to just march ahead with the pawns. And black played d6. After this move, it's a proper King's Indian defense. White plays bishop e2 and black plays e5. This is the King's Indian classical variation. And the main line from this position is to play short castle, knight c6, d5, knight e7. And this is one of my favorite lines. It's you are preparing to play knight f6 to e8 maybe, or knight to d7, and then black can go f5, f4 and try to prepare g5 and just pawn storm white. So it's a full-scale kingside attack that black is aiming for. And white's counterplay is usually to prepare the move, the pawn break c4 to c5, and white will try to play on the queen side. So white and black has different goals, and it's a little bit of a race, but it's quite fun to play. Kasparov, Nakamura, Bobby Fischer, they all had a King's Indian as a favorite line. But in this game, they didn't follow the main line, and white deviated. He actually took on e5 in this position. So this totally changes the character of the game, and it becomes a queenless middle game. It's less sharp. It's not that ambitious for white to play this way, but it's a good psychological choice against aggressive or tactical players. It could be a very good choice if you're white. If you like this kind of position and you want to try this line as white, I would recommend that you have a look at Ulf Andersson's games. He liked to play these positions that come after d takes e5. So in the game, white took on d8, rook takes d8 and bishop g5, pinning the knight. It's a good move. And it's not so easy to get out of this pin. I mean, if you play h6 to pressure this bishop on g5, white can just take the knight, bishop take f6, and then knight d5 with a double attack on f6 and c7. So in the game, black played rook e8. This gets out of the pin and also protects the e5 pawn. White played knight d5, and black decides to take this knight. C takes d5, and black plays c6 to put some pressure on the white center immediately. And he would probably be very happy if white decides to take on c6, because then you can take with a knight and your bishop can go to e6, and that's a comfortable development. But usually your opponent is not that willing to help you, so that was also the case with Rudolf. He decided to play bishop c4 to reinforce the center and keep the tension a bit longer in the center. Black decides to take on d5, bishop takes d5, and now Fischer plays knight d7. As far as I can tell, this was a new method that Fischer introduced in this game. It hasn't been seen before. Usually, instead of knight d7, black usually plays knight c6 before this game, and then follow up with bishop e6 to fight against the white center. So knight d7 was played, and white plays rook c1. It's a very natural move, and white is preparing to go to c7 with the rook probably. And now black plays h6. This is a move that is quite useful. It's asking the bishop a question. So does white want to keep the control over h4 to d8 diagonal as he have right now? Or does he need to find some other useful purpose for this bishop? In the game, white decides to play bishop e3, and this takes off a little bit of pressure on black, and black gets to play knight to f6 because he has regained some control of the dark square, so he can play this move. And knight f6 attacks the bishop on d5. It also attacks the pawn on e4. So it's an active defensive move. And white decides that he wants to keep the light squared bishop, and he decides to give up the pawn, that it's worth it to keep, and to keep the bishop and also get some initiative in the position. So bishop was played to b3. Fischer takes the pawn on e4, and now white plays rook c7. So white have a lot of pressure here. He's got an active light squared bishop and a rook on c7, but black has an extra pawn. So you could try to play rook f8 and just keep the extra pawn, but it's a little bit greedy, and usually that way of playing is usually punished. And if you would play rook f8 in this position, then white has a very strong move. He can play knight to h4, and it's not so easy because you are actually attacking the g6 pawn. f7 cannot take back because of the bishop on b3 is pinning the f7 pawn against the king. So if you play king h7, then you immediately drop the f7 pawn. So you could try to play bishop f5 to hold on to this pawn, but then g4 would be a strong move. Bishop takes g4 and knight takes g6. This is not a fun position to play as black. So in the game, after rook c7, Fischer decided to immediately give back the pawn with bishop e6 to basically, this bishop on b3 is quite annoying. So by playing bishop e6, you give back the pawn, but you take out this bishop from the game. White takes on e6, rook takes e6, and now rook takes b7. So the position has changed a little bit. There has been some imbalance that has been created as a result of these last few moves. Black has gained a pawn majority on the king side. He has a four pawns versus 3 pawns on the king side, and white has a 2 versus 1 on the queen side. So black played rook a6 here. I would probably, if I would play the black pieces, I would also have a look at rook c6 as an alternative. But probably if you play rook c6, white can just go short castle, rook c2, and rook d1. So the rook on c2 is not that strong as it looks, because the rook on b7 is protecting the b2 pawn. And next white will play rook 1 to d7 and probably g3 to get an escape route for the king. And white will have a very good position, very active rooks on the 7th rank. So Fischer's move rook a6 is probably a better choice. And white plays a3 and knight goes to d6 here, attacks the rook on b7. Because this is an active rook, and you should probably try to harass it a little bit if you can. So the rook goes to b4. He likes to keep control at least of the b file, so the b2 pawn is not easily attacked. And now Fischer goes back to c6 with the rook, because he doesn't do that much on a6, because the pawn on a3 is defended, and the a7 pawn doesn't have such strong opposition right now from white's pieces. So rook c6, white makes a short castle, and this is probably a good time to have a think about the position, to choose a plan for black, how to continue. And probably Fischer had a cup of coffee and had a long think here, and then he decided that his pawn majority on the king side, that is something that he could base his play or formulate a plan from, this fact that he has a pawn king side majority. So he decides to play f5 to start a pawn storm on this side of the board. It's a very nice move, and white decided to play g3. Now white is trying to prevent get some air for the king, but also make it more difficult for black to play f4 probably. So this is a good time to pause the video if you like to consider how black should continue from this position. And this is a typical position that is critical, and even if there's no decisions to be made about exchanges in the center or something like that, so it's still important what continuation you choose from here. In the game, Fischer continued with g5, which is a nice move. It might be tempting instead of g5 to play e4 to gain a tempo against the knight, but it also weakens the d4 square, and it also makes it more difficult to play f4 because you no longer have a pawn on e5 to support this push. So you lose some possibilities, or you have to prepare this f4 more. So g5 is stronger, and after g5, rook d1 was played, and black continued with a5. White played rook a4. And now black played knight c4, preparing to take on e3 perhaps, and also attacking the b2 pawn, which would fork the both white rooks. So white plays rook c1 to put a bind on this knight on c4, a pin. So if he moves, the rook on c6 is hanging. But this is not that strong pin, so Black decides to take on b2 anyway. Also a continuation here is to play rook ac8 is also quite good for black. And but in the game, Fischer decides to take on b2. Rook takes c6. Knight takes a4. And now white plays a very active move, quite good move, h4. He is a pawn down, so it's important to play actively. Black pushes the f4 pawn, bishop to d2, and the pawns keep moving. He plays e4, knight e1, f takes g3. He could take back on g3, I guess, but he decides to play rook c4 to attack the knight on a4 and also attack this pawn on e4. Black plays g takes f2, king takes, and e3 check. I'm not sure why he did that move. Not 100% sure. But king takes, knight b6, rook e4, knight e5 check, king e2, and knight f6 attacks the rook. Rook a4. The position is already getting, the possibilities are not too great for black in this position, I think, even though he has a pawn extra. But it's very difficult to win a position like this. So in the game he just took on h4, and Rudolf took back with the rook. He played king h7, the rook goes back on a4, where he has a good attack on this a5 pawn. Rook check, king f3. So basically this a5 pawn looks like it's gonna fall. Knight d7, rook takes a5, knight e5 check, king f2. White offered a draw and black accepted. So the first round for Fischer in Stockholm, the Interzonal tournament 1962, it was a draw. So thank you very much for watching. I hope we learned something about asking questions like this h6 move. And if you enjoyed the game, please consider subscribing, and hope to see you again. If you have any comments, any questions, just write them and I will try to answer. Thank you very much, and goodbye.